Jake Morrison walked slowly through the massive doors of the Galactic Council building. His black suit was perfectly pressed and his tie was straight. Behind him, 2 other humans followed just as quietly. Dr. Lisa Campbell carried her data pad close to her chest. Commander Ryan Blake kept his hands behind his back and his face calm. The 3 humans had done this walk many times before. For 3 long years, they had come to these meetings. For 3 long years, they had sat in the lowest seats and listened to alien species talk about humanity like they were children. For 3 long years, they had smiled and nodded and said, "Please and thank you." Today felt different somehow. The council chamber was huge. The ceiling went up so high that Jake could barely see the top. Thousands of seats filled the round space in layers, with the most important species sitting at the top and the least important at the bottom. The human seats were at the very bottom, right next to the floor. Jake had counted those seats many times. 3 small chairs that looked like an afterthought. Meanwhile, the Veltar Empire had an entire section with golden chairs and their own private entrance. The Mordak Federation had silver seats with built-in cooling systems. Even species that Jake had never heard of had better seating than the humans. As they walked to their seats, Jake heard the whispers start. They always did. Alien voices speaking. In languages he didn't understand, but the tone was always the same. Dismissive, mocking, sometimes amused. "Look, the pets are here again," one voice said in broken English, probably for the humans to hear. "I wonder what they will beg for today," said another. Jake's jaw tightened just a little, but his smile never changed. He had practiced that smile in the mirror for hours. Lisa had told him once that it was his best diplomatic tool. Ryan had said it was probably the only thing keeping humanity from being kicked out of the council entirely. They reached their seats and sat down. The chairs were uncomfortable and too small for human bodies. Jake was sure that was on purpose. Everything about human treatment in the council seemed designed to remind them of their place. Speaker Zarthek entered the chamber through the grand doorway reserved for council leadership. The massive Veltar moved on 6 legs, each step making a clicking sound on the polished floor. His 4 eyes swept across the chamber, lingering on the human section for just a moment. Jake thought he saw something like amusement in those alien eyes. "The council will come to order," Zarthek announced. His voice was deep and carried easily through the chamber without any need for amplification. "Today we address Resolution 847 Alpha regarding the continued status of the human species within council jurisdiction." Jake felt his stomach drop. They had known this was coming, but hearing it announced so casually still hurt. Resolution 847 Alpha was the quarantine proposal. If it passed, humanity would be locked into their home system for another 50 years. No expansion, no new colonies, no growth. "The resolution text will now be read," Zarthek continued. A smaller alien that Jake didn't recognize stepped forward and began reading from a long scroll. The language was formal and full of big words, but the meaning was simple enough. Humanity was too dangerous to be allowed to spread through the galaxy. They were too aggressive, too unpredictable, too young, as a species to be trusted with space travel. Jake had heard these arguments before. Every species in the council had apparently gone through a period of being too aggressive when they were younger. The difference was that those species had been judged by other young species who were still learning the rules themselves. Humanity was being judged by ancient civilizations that had forgotten what it was like to grow and change. As the reading continued, Jake looked around the chamber. Most of the alien representatives looked bored. A few were reading their own documents or having quiet conversations. This was routine for them. The fate of an entire species was just another item on their daily agenda. Lisa leaned over and whispered, "The vote count looks bad. We might only get 20 opposition votes." Jake nodded slightly. 20 votes out of more than 800. Even if every single minor species voted against the resolution, it wouldn't matter. The 5 major species controlled more than half the votes by themselves, and they had made their position clear months ago. The reading finished and Zarthek called for preliminary statements. One by one, representatives from the major species stood to explain their positions. Each speech was longer than the last, and each one said essentially the same thing. Humans were not ready. Humans needed more time to mature. Humans should be grateful for the Council's patience and wisdom. The Veltar representative spoke about humanity's concerning military buildup. The Mordak delegate mentioned cultural incompatibilities. The Jektar ambassador talked about the necessity of gradual integration. Jake wanted to stand up and remind them that humanity had never started a war with any Council species. He wanted to point out that human colonies had actually helped several struggling worlds get back on their feet. He wanted to ask why species that had committed genocide in living memory were lecturing humanity about being too aggressive. Instead, he sat quietly and maintained his diplomatic smile. When the preliminary statements ended, Zarthek announced that formal voting would begin. Jake was allowed to make one statement before the vote, as was traditional for the species being discussed. He stood up slowly and walked to the speaking platform in the center of the chamber. 800 pairs of alien eyes looked down at him. Some curious, some bored, some openly hostile. He had 30 seconds to speak for all of humanity. Honored Council members, Jake began, his voice steady and respectful. Humanity asks only for the chance to prove ourselves through our actions, not our potential for actions we have never taken. We have followed every Council regulation. We have honored every treaty. We have contributed to the galactic community in every way we have been permitted. A few aliens shifted in their seats, Jake continued. We understand the Council's caution, but we believe 3 years of perfect cooperation should count for something. We respectfully request that you judge us on what we have done, not on what you fear we might do. Jake walked back to his seat. 30 seconds. That was all humanity got to defend its future. The voting began immediately. The voting started exactly as Jake expected. One by one, alien representatives stood and cast their votes. The pattern was always the same. The major species voted first, their voices loud and confident. Then the middle-tier species followed, usually copying whatever the big powers had decided. Finally, the minor species got their turn, though everyone knew their votes didn't really matter. The Veltar Empire votes in favor of Resolution 847 Alpha, Zarthek announced, his 4 eyes gleaming with satisfaction. The Mordak Federation votes in favor. The Jektar Collective votes in favor. Jake kept his face neutral, but inside he was counting. Each vote felt like a hammer blow. Lisa was writing numbers on her pad, keeping track of the tally. Ryan sat perfectly still, his military training keeping his emotions hidden. The voting continued for 20 minutes. Jake had been through this process enough times to know how it worked. The major species had already decided the outcome in private meetings that humans were never invited to. This public vote was just theater. When the final vote was counted, the result was exactly what Jake had feared. 732 votes in favor. Only 18 votes against. The rest were abstentions from species too afraid to pick a side. Resolution 847 Alpha passes, Zarthek announced. Humanity will remain under quarantine restrictions for an additional 50-year period. Jake felt Lisa's hand tighten on her pen. Ryan's breathing got slightly deeper, but Jake just nodded politely and prepared to stand. This was how these meetings always ended. Humanity would file a formal objection that would be ignored, and they would come back in a few months to try again. Then Zarthek's voice cut through the chamber again. Before we adjourn, the Council will address Amendment 847 Beta, which was submitted this morning. Jake froze. There was no Amendment 847 Beta on the agenda. He looked at Lisa, who was frantically checking her documents. Ryan was already reaching for his communication device. Amendment 847 Beta addresses the issue of existing human colonies beyond the Sol system. Zarthek continued, his voice carrying a note of barely concealed pleasure. The amendment requires the immediate evacuation of all human settlements in Council-controlled space. The chamber erupted in murmurs and conversations. Jake felt his blood go cold. This wasn't just about stopping human expansion anymore. This was about destroying the colonies that already existed. Lisa leaned over and whispered urgently, New Haven has 12,000 people. Kepler Station has 5,000. The mining colony on Ross 128 has 3,000 families. Jake's mind raced. Those weren't just numbers. Those were people. Human children who had been born on other worlds. Families who had spent years building new lives. Scientists and engineers who were doing important work. All of them would be forced to abandon everything and return to an already overcrowded Earth. The Council recognizes that this amendment was not on the original agenda, Zarthek said, but emergency measures are sometimes necessary to address urgent situations. What urgent situation? Jake called out, breaking protocol by speaking without permission. Zarthek's 4 eyes focused on him with something like amusement. The situation of human colonies occupying space that rightfully belongs to Council member species. Those colonies were established in empty systems, Jake replied, his voice getting slightly louder. There were no other species living there. Nevertheless, those systems fall within the traditional territorial claims of Council members, Zarthek said smoothly. The Veltar Empire has ancient rights to the New Haven system, dating back over 2,000 years. Jake wanted to scream. The Veltar had never even visited the New Haven system until humans had built a colony there. Their ancient rights were just words on old maps that had never been enforced. I request permission to speak on behalf of humanity, Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. Permission denied, Zarthek replied without hesitation. The amendment period for junior species has already passed. When was the amendment period? Jake asked. This morning, before the session began. Jake felt his diplomatic training cracking. How could we participate in an amendment period that we weren't told about? All Council members were notified according to proper procedures, Zarthek said. Perhaps humanity should pay closer attention to official communications. Lisa was checking her communication device frantically. We never received any notification, she whispered. The voting on the amendment began immediately. Jake watched, in growing horror as species after species voted to destroy human colonies. Some of the votes came from species that had never even spoken to humans before. Others came from species that humans had helped in the past. The Altarian representative stood to vote. Jake remembered meeting her at a diplomatic dinner just 2 months ago. She had thanked him for human medical supplies that had helped fight a plague on her homeworld. Now she was voting to kick human families out of their homes. The Altarian Collective votes in favor of Amendment 847 Beta, she said, not looking. At the human section, more votes followed. Each one felt like a betrayal. Jake had spent 3 years building relationships with these people. He had attended their cultural events, learned their customs, treated them with respect. Now they were throwing all of that away for political convenience. Ryan was watching the vote count with professional interest. They're not even trying to hide it anymore, he whispered to Jake. This is just a power play. Jake nodded grimly. The mask was coming off. The Council wasn't even pretending to be fair anymore. They were showing their true colors, and those colors were ugly. The final vote was even worse than the first one. 812 votes in favor. Only 6 votes against. The amendment passed by an overwhelming margin. Amendment 847 Beta passes, Zarthek announced. Human colonies will be evacuated within 90 standard days. Jake stood up slowly. His legs felt shaky, but his mind was crystal clear. 3 years of diplomatic courtesy, 3 years of following the rules. 3 years of believing that reason and good faith could overcome prejudice and fear. All of it had been wasted. Lisa was staring at her datapad in shock. 90 days, she whispered. They're giving us 90 days to move 20,000 people. Ryan was completely still, but Jake could see the tension in his shoulders. The commander was thinking about logistics, about what it would take to evacuate that many people in such a short time. It was barely possible, and only if everything went perfectly. Zarthek was already moving on to other business, discussing trade agreements and territorial disputes, as if he hadn't just sentenced 20,000 humans to exile. The other council members were settling back into their seats, satisfied with their day's work. Jake looked around the chamber one more time. at the golden seats of the Veltar Empire, at the silver chairs of the Mordak Federation, at the hundreds of species that had just voted to destroy human lives without a second thought. Something cold and hard settled in his chest. Something that had been building for 3 years of polite humiliation. Something that was done with being patient and reasonable and diplomatic. Jake Morrison had been polite for the last time. Jake Morrison stood up from his small chair at the bottom of the council chamber. The movement was slow and deliberate. Every alien eye in the massive room was focused elsewhere, on Speaker Zarthek, who was already discussing the next item on the agenda. To them, the human problem had been solved. Case closed. No, Jake said quietly. The word hung in the air like a stone dropped in still water. A few nearby aliens turned to look at him with mild curiosity. Most didn't even notice. Speaker Zarthek continued reading from his datapad about some trade dispute between the Mordak and the Jektar. His voice droned on about shipping routes and tariff adjustments. No, Jake said again, louder this time. More. Heads turned. The aliens closest to the human section were starting to pay attention. A low murmur began to spread through the chamber as creatures realized something unusual was happening. Zarthek finally looked up from his pad. His 4 eyes focused on Jake with something between annoyance and amusement. I beg your pardon, Ambassador Morrison? Did you have something to add to the trade discussion? Jake took a step forward away from his assigned seat. His voice carried clearly through the chamber, and for the first time in 3 years, it held no trace of diplomatic courtesy. I said no. We will not be evacuating our colonies. We will not be accepting your quarantine. And we are withdrawing from all council treaties and agreements effective immediately. The chamber erupted. Hundreds of voices began talking at once, in dozens of different languages. Some aliens were laughing, others looked shocked. A few seemed angry that their routine had been interrupted. Zarthek raised one of his massive clawed hands for silence. The noise gradually died down. Ambassador Morrison, I think you may be confused about how this process works. The council has voted. The matter is decided. You do not get to simply refuse. Jake walked closer to the center of the chamber. Lisa and Ryan followed him, their diplomatic masks falling away just as completely as his had. For 3 years, they had been the perfect representatives of a respectful, law-abiding species. That performance was over. You want to know what I'm confused about? Jake asked, his voice getting stronger. I'm confused about why we ever thought you people were worth talking to. The laughter from the alien section got louder. Several representatives were making jokes in their own languages. Jake could hear enough to know they were mocking him. For 3 years we have been polite, Jake continued, raising his voice to carry over the noise. For 3 years we have followed your rules, respected your customs, and listened to your lectures about civilization. We did this because we believed in the possibility of cooperation. We believed that intelligent species could work together, based on mutual respect. The chamber was getting quieter now. Something in Jake's tone was cutting through the mockery. That was our mistake, Jake said. We assumed you were interested in cooperation. We assumed you were capable of respect. We assumed wrong. Zarthek's amusement was fading. Ambassador Morrison, you are out of order. Return to your seat immediately, or you will be removed from the chamber. Jake ignored him completely. You want to talk about civilization? Let me tell you what we learned about your civilization while we were being polite. We learned that the Veltar Empire maintains secret cloning facilities where they grow slave workers. We learned that the Mordak Federation operates concentration camps for species they consider inferior. We learned that the Jektar Collective has committed genocide against at least 6 different species in the last century. The chamber went dead silent. Even the whispered conversations stopped. We learned that this council has covered up wars, hidden atrocities, and rewritten history to make monsters look like heroes, Jake continued. And you have the nerve to lecture humanity about being too aggressive? Several alien representatives were on their feet now, shouting in their own languages. Jake couldn't understand the words, but the anger was clear enough. You want to know what human aggression really looks like? Jake asked. You're about to find out, because we are done being polite. Zarthek was trying to restore order, but the chamber was in chaos. Some species were demanding that Jake be arrested. Others were calling for emergency votes. A few were already heading for the exits. Commander Ryan Blake stepped forward and activated his personal communicator. The device shouldn't have worked. In the council chamber, which was supposed to be protected by the most advanced signal-blocking technology in the galaxy. The fact that it worked perfectly sent a chill through every alien who understood the implications. Control, this is Blake, Ryan said into the device. His voice was calm and professional, cutting through the chaos around him. Phoenix Protocol is now active. Authorization code Sierra 77 Alpha. Request status report on all positions. The response came through crystal clear, broadcast for the entire chamber to hear. Luna Base, operational and ready. Mars Command, operational and ready. Titan Station, operational and ready. Deep Space Fleet Alpha, operational and ready. The confirmations kept coming. Dozens of them. Each one representing military installations that weren't supposed to exist. Each one proof that humanity had been preparing for this moment for years. Dr. Lisa Campbell walked to the center of the chamber and activated a holographic projector. The device materialized a three-dimensional map of the galaxy in the air above the council floor. Bright red dots appeared throughout the display, marking human positions. While you were debating our fitness for civilization, Lisa said, her scientific calm replaced by something much harder. We were studying you, every species in this chamber, your planets, your defenses, your weaknesses. The hologram shifted, showing detailed images of alien homeworlds and military bases. The level of detail was impossible. No outside species should have that kind of intelligence about council member worlds. We know about your secret facilities, Lisa continued. We know about your hidden fleets. We know about every dirty secret you thought you had buried. More red dots appeared on the display. Human assets distributed throughout the galaxy, hidden in asteroid fields disguised as mining operations, camouflaged as research stations. The scope of it was staggering. Jake's voice cut through the stunned silence. Did you really think we would trust our species' survival to the goodwill of people? Who considered genocide a reasonable political tool? The hologram changed again, showing human ships moving into position around key council worlds. Not attacking, not threatening, just there. Visible, undeniable. We tried to do this the easy way, Jake said. We offered friendship, cooperation, mutual benefit. You responded with contempt, prejudice, and threats. So now we do it the hard way. Zarthek was backing away from the central platform, his four eyes wide with something that might have been fear. This is an act of war, he managed to say. Jake smiled for the first time since the vote had been announced. It wasn't his diplomatic smile. It was something much more dangerous. No, he said quietly. This is what happens when you mistake human politeness for human weakness. War is what comes next if you don't start showing some respect. The chamber was completely silent now. 800 alien representatives stared at 3 humans who had just turned their galaxy upside down. Jake Morrison was done being polite. The silence in the council chamber lasted exactly 17 seconds. Jake counted them. Then chaos erupted like a dam breaking. Half the alien representatives were shouting at once. Some were screaming for security forces. Others were demanding immediate military action against humanity. A few were calling for emergency evacuation of the chamber. Many were simply yelling in languages Jake didn't recognize, but fear sounded the same in any tongue. Speaker Zarthek was frantically pressing buttons on his control panel, trying to activate the chamber's defense systems. Nothing happened. The screens that should have shown security alerts remained blank. The blast doors that should have sealed the chamber stayed open. Your security systems have been offline for 2 hours, Commander Ryan Blake said calmly. He was still holding his communicator, still receiving status reports from human forces across the galaxy. We needed time to make sure this conversation wouldn't be interrupted. The Veltar representative, a massive creature called Hector, stood up in his golden chair. This is an act of terrorism. The Council demands immediate surrender of all human forces. Jake looked up at him with something that might have been pity. Demands? You're in no position to make demands anymore. Dr. Lisa Campbell manipulated her holographic display, zooming in on the Veltar homeworld. The image showed massive orbital stations surrounding the planet, bristling with weapons. But scattered among them were smaller objects that looked like asteroids or space debris. Those aren't asteroids, Lisa said quietly. They're human observation posts. We've been watching your homeworld for 18 months. We know about your secret weapons programs. We know about your slave production facilities. We know about the political prisoners you've been experimenting on. Hector's forearms trembled with rage. Lies! Veltar territory is perfectly defended. No alien ships could penetrate our security. You're right, Lisa agreed. No alien ships could. But you never considered that some of those asteroids in your system might be artificial. Amazing what you can build when you hollow out a rock and fill it with sensors. The hologram shifted to show similar installations around other Council worlds. The Mordak Federation's military bases were surrounded by what looked like mining operations. The Zektar Collective's research stations had human monitoring posts disguised as communication relays. Every major species in this council has been under human observation for at least a year, Lisa continued. We know your military capabilities, your resource distributions, your population centers. We know everything. The Mordak representative, a thin creature with gray skin, was frantically talking into his own communicator. Jake could hear enough to know he was trying to contact his homeworld's defense forces. The conversation wasn't going well. Having trouble reaching home? Jake asked pleasantly. The Mordak alien looked at him with wide, dark eyes. Our communication networks are experiencing difficulties. That's because they run through relay stations that we built for you, Ryan explained. Remember the Great Communication Upgrade project from 2 years ago? The one where human engineers volunteered to help modernize the galactic communication grid? We did that for free, out of the goodness of our hearts. Jake's smile was sharp now. Funny how goodness of heart can be so practical sometimes. More aliens were trying to contact their homeworlds. None of them were having any success. The communication blackout was spreading as human-controlled relays went offline one by one. The Altarian representative, the same one who had voted against human colonies after humanity had saved her people from plague, was pressing her communicator, frantically. Nothing, I can't reach anyone. The plague medicine we sent to your world came with some interesting side effects, Lisa said conversationally. Not harmful to your people, of course. We're not monsters. But the nanobots in the medicine? They've been very busy mapping your infrastructure. The chamber was getting quieter now as the implications sank in. Species after species was discovering that their communications were down. Their defenses were compromised. Their secrets were exposed. Jake walked to the center of the chamber, directly under the massive council seal. For 3 years, he had looked up at that symbol and tried to believe it represented something noble. Now he saw it for what it really was, a pretty decoration on an ugly system. You want to know the really funny part? Jake asked. We didn't want any of this. All we wanted was to be treated fairly, to have our voices heard, to build a future together based on mutual respect. He gestured around the chamber. Look at all this. The technology, the preparation, the intelligence gathering. Do you know how much work this was? How many resources we had to divert from peaceful projects? How many brilliant minds we had to pull away from scientific research and medical advancement? Several aliens were staring at him now with something approaching understanding. We could have been exploring new worlds together, Jake continued. We could have been sharing knowledge, trading ideas, building something amazing. Instead, we had to spend 3 years preparing for war because you couldn't see past your own prejudices. The Zektar representative, an insect-like creature with multiple eyes, spoke up in a shaky voice. What do you want from us? Jake looked around the chamber one more time. At the golden seats and silver chairs. At the aliens who had voted to destroy human families without a second thought. at the representatives of species who had committed atrocities and then lectured humanity about aggression. "What do we want?" Jake repeated. "We want what we've always wanted. Respect, equality, the right to exist without begging permission from people who think genocide is acceptable politics." Ryan's communicator crackled to life again. "Control to Blake. Phoenix Fleet reports ready status. All primary targets are locked, awaiting orders." The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop. Phoenix Fleet wasn't on any of the holographic displays that Lisa had shown. It was something else entirely. "Primary targets?" Zarthek asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake's expression didn't change. "Military installations, government centers, communications hubs, the infrastructure that keeps your civilizations running. We're not interested in killing civilians, but we're perfectly willing to send you back to the Stone Age if that's what it takes." The silence stretched out again. But this time it wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of species realizing that their entire understanding of the galaxy had just changed. "Of course," Jake continued conversationally, "there is another option." Every alien in the chamber leaned forward slightly. "You could try treating us like equals instead of pets," Jake said simply. "You could stop making decisions about our future without including us in the conversation. You could build a council that actually represents all species instead of just the ones with the biggest fleets." He paused, letting the words sink in. Choice is yours. But you need to make it in the next 10 minutes because that's when Phoenix Fleet starts target acquisition." Jake Morrison stood in the center of the Galactic Council chamber and waited to see what choice they would make. 10 minutes felt like 10 hours. Jake Morrison stood in the center of the council chamber and watched 800 alien representatives try to figure out what to do. Some were still attempting to contact their homeworlds. Others were arguing among themselves in hushed, urgent voices. A few were simply staring at the holographic displays showing human forces positioned throughout the galaxy. Speaker Zarthek was having a heated conversation with several other Veltar officials. Jake could hear enough to know they were discussing military options. The conversation wasn't going well for them. "Sir," Commander Ryan Blake said quietly, "Phoenix Fleet is requesting confirmation. Target acquisition begins in 3 minutes. Jake nodded but kept his eyes on the council. "Tell them to stand by." Dr. Lisa Campbell was monitoring communications from across the galaxy. Her face was grim as she listened to reports coming in from human observation posts. 17 species have tried to mobilize their fleets in the last 8 minutes, she reported. None of them have been successful. The reason was simple. Human engineers had been helping to upgrade alien military systems for 2 years. Those upgrades included some very special features that the aliens had never been told about. The Mordak representative stood up suddenly. His gray skin was even paler than usual and his hands were shaking. "Our defense fleet won't respond to commands," he announced to the chamber. "The computers say all systems are functioning normally, but nothing happens when we try to activate weapons or move ships." Similar reports were coming from other species. The Jektar couldn't launch their fighters. The Altarians couldn't bring their orbital platforms online. The Veltar battle stations were completely unresponsive. "Remote override protocols," Ryan explained calmly. "Standard feature in all human-designed software. We thought it was important to have an emergency shutdown capability." Jake checked the time display on the chamber wall. 2 minutes left. "This is madness." Hector, the Veltar representative, shouted from his golden chair. "You cannot hold the entire galaxy hostage." "We're not holding anyone hostage," Jake replied. "We're offering you a choice. You can have the old system where a few powerful species make all the decisions. Or you can have a new system where everyone gets a voice. Choose." "And if we choose the old system?" Zarthek asked. Jake's expression didn't change. "Then you'll discover that the old system depended on technology and infrastructure that we now control. You'll find out how well your civilizations function when your computers don't work. Your communications are down, and your fleets can't leave port." 1 minute left. The chamber erupted in frantic conversations as species tried to coordinate some kind of response. But coordination was impossible when no one could talk to their governments back home. 30 seconds, Ryan announced. Jake was about to give the final order when a small voice spoke up from one of the highest tiers. Wait. The voice belonged to the representative of the Kepler Collective, a minor species that Jake barely remembered meeting. The alien was small and fragile-looking, with large eyes and pale blue skin. She stood up slowly in her modest seat near the back of the chamber. The Kepler Collective formally requests a new vote, she said, her voice growing stronger. We propose the immediate dissolution of the current council structure and the formation of a new galactic federation, based on equal representation for all species. The chamber went completely silent. Seconded, said another small voice. This one came from the Centauri delegation, another minor species. Thirded, called out the Altarian representative, the same one who had voted against human colonies an hour ago. More voices joined in. Species that had been ignored and marginalized for centuries were finally seeing a chance to be heard. The momentum was building. This is ridiculous, Zarthek bellowed. The major species will never agree to equal representation. We have responsibilities. We have experience. You have 10 seconds, Jake interrupted quietly. The Veltar speaker looked around the chamber desperately. His allies among the major species were silent. Even they could see which way the wind was blowing. Time, Ryan announced. Jake opened his mouth to give the order, but Zarthek's voice cut him off. Wait! The council accepts the proposal for reorganization. Jake paused. Full equality? Every species gets one vote regardless of size or military power? Zarthek's 4 eyes were filled with fury, but his voice was steady. Yes. Human colonies remain where they are? Yes. All. Quarantine restrictions on humanity are lifted immediately? Yes. Jake looked around the chamber one more time, at the golden seats that would soon be replaced with something more modest, at the representatives of species that had spent centuries believing they were better than everyone else, at the aliens, who were just now realizing that their galaxy had changed forever. Phoenix Fleet, stand down, Jake said into Ryan's communicator. All forces return to normal status. The relief in the chamber was almost physical. Several aliens sagged in their seats. Others were already making calls to their homeworlds to explain what had happened, but Jake wasn't finished. There's one more thing, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. This new federation? Humanity doesn't want to lead it. We don't want to be the ones making decisions for everyone else. We just want to be part of it. He walked back toward his small chair at the bottom of the chamber, then stopped and turned around. Oh, and one more thing. Those human colonies you tried to evacuate? They're going to be accepting refugees. Any species that wants to start over, somewhere new is welcome. We believe in giving people second chances. Jake sat down in his uncomfortable chair and smiled his old diplomatic smile, but now it was genuine. 6 months later, the new Galactic Federation held its first meeting. The chamber had been redesigned. Instead of tiers with the powerful at the top and the weak at the bottom, there was a simple circle with identical seats for every species. Ambassador Jake Morrison sat in the human section and listened to representatives from 800 different worlds discuss trade agreements, scientific cooperation, and cultural exchange programs. No one was being talked down to. No one was being ignored. No one was being threatened with quarantine or forced evacuation. It wasn't perfect. There were still arguments and disagreements and political maneuvering. But now, everyone had a voice. Everyone had a vote. Everyone mattered. Jake thought about the 3 years of polite diplomatic frustration that had led to this moment. About the massive military buildup that humanity had hoped never to use. About the 10 minutes when the galaxy had balanced on the edge of war. It had been worth it. Sometimes you had to stop being polite to remind people what politeness was really worth. Jake Morrison leaned back in his identical chair and smiled. The galaxy was a much more interesting place when everyone got to participate in it. The human polite mode had shut down for exactly 10 minutes. That had been enough to change everything.